Nihility simply means nothing, non-existence. The concept of nihilism is based around the rejection of all moral concepts and general sense of meaning, living with the assumption that life and existence is in general a totally meaningless exercise. When we look into the void looks back into us and applies a debuff. I think. Pretty sure that's what this class is about, but apparently not. We're going to find out. It's kind of a weird one. Nihility is the final class in Honkai Star Rail for us to go over. I want to point out that I've made a few jokes at the expense of this class over the course of this series, but I do not have anything against this class, and its admittedly muddled sense of cohesion. It's a neat class, and on its face you would assume it serves as the inverse of the Harmony class that we've already talked about, and in a way it does, but it also, it doesn't. Let's just jump right in. No day one unit better serves to show you what Nihility is, quite like Pela does. Pela's main piece of utility comes from her ult, which is an AoE attack that inflicts a defense debuff on enemies. It's simple, it's effective, and it's damn near universal in its usefulness. Her skill is able to remove a buff from an enemy, but why don't you go ahead and ask Lochwa over here how often that comes in handy these days. Oh, poor Lochwa. No, Pela is mostly used as a defense trade unit, and that alone. Just that one piece of utility does make her usable in almost any team. Funnily enough, I also don't really like her Eidolons at all. They mostly support the use of her skill and her friggin' personal damage for some reason, which is weird because she doesn't do damage. But in the end, her ult is still a very good piece of utility that can be used in almost any team. She's considered to be one of a, really, really good launch day units. Aside from units like Ting Yun, there aren't probably a lot of ones that are better than her when it comes to just launch day 4 stars at the very least. And she sets a good precedent for what an Nihility unit is. Like I mentioned earlier, Pela is just the inverse of a Harmony unit. Harmony applies a buff to make you stronger. Nihility debuffs an enemy to make you stronger by comparison. It's basically the same thing, and that's kind of what Nihility is. For like 2 units. Well, it's gonna get off the rails pretty quickly, but right now, that is what Nihility is about. It's about debuffing enemies to make your unit stronger by comparison. Anyway, Welt is one of the units that actually falls into this category. He does that job. He's in the same vein as Pela in that he is a debuff-focused unit, except his debuffs are focused on speed. He uses a speed debuff along with the Imprison effect to debilitate enemies' ability to act. Early on, Welt was also used as a damage dealer, but that's probably not a great option these days, but back in the day, sure, go nuts. His Ascension passives do lean more into his ability to deal damage, as well as help with his energy requirements. One way that Welt would go on to be played is as a pseudo-sustain unit in some teams, since he focused on grinding enemy actions to a halt, and the best way to sustain a team is to just never take damage. So if the enemy never moves, you never take damage, so he can kind of do that. So far so good, right? 2 units in and we have 2 somewhat simple units that serve as a great example of what Nihility is. It's the debuff class, it's another support class, and it's focused on putting debuffs on enemies to make you have a better time handling them. We've got one more launch day unit to look at for Nihility, so let's round out our debuffers with Sampo. So buddy, what do you debuff? We have a defense shredder and a slowing unit already, so what do you bring to the class? Damage over time. Okay, before you say this, let me get this out of the way. Yes, damage over time effects are debuffs. By the definition the game gives you, they do count as debuffs. Do damage over time effects perform the same role as debuffs? No, they do not. They do not even do anywhere near close to the same thing as an actual debuff. This is where Nihility begins to lose the plot within its own identity for me, or at least where it just kind of initially does. It gets screwy in different ways way later down the line. We'll get to that, trust me. That being said, dot units and traditional debuff units could have, and I think should have, personally, been made into 2 separate classes. And it probably would have been a better way to do it, in my humble opinion, not to read too far ahead, but dot has become a fairly underappreciated and undersupported archetype of team, especially when we get into the 2.x series of patches. And if they were their own class instead of being tacked onto the regular debuff class, then it would be harder for Hoyo to just kind of ignore the whole archetype, I think. Or, I mean, they still could if they wanted to, but it would be a bit more obvious. We'll dive into how this kind of change could have maybe helped dot units more later on, but you could have used like Propagation or one of the other non-class paths to serve as Dot's actual home, and I do think everyone would kind of been better off if that was the case. The last thing I'll say for this, for now, before we actually dive into Sampo's kit, because we still have to dive into his kit obviously, is that debuffers are by their nature supports. Pela, for some reason, does have some buffs to her personal damage potential in her Eidolons. Those Eidolons suck, but she is clearly a support who is meant to shred defense for your main carry. Welt had respectable damage for a 1.0 unit, but like Pela is mostly there to slow and immobilize enemies. Dot units are more akin to traditional damage dealers, as their main use relies on them dealing damage over time. This is the divide that really doesn't make the most sense to me, but once again, we'll cover more of this idea once we filled out more of the roster. Let's go back to Sampo though and see what he does. His kit's actually really simple. His skill is a bounce attack meant to help trigger his talent, which has a chance to inflict the wind shear dot effect on any enemy that it hits. His ult is an AoE that can cause hit enemies to take increased dot damage for 2 turns, and yes, that is a debuff, but it's also a debuff that is only specifically going to help dot damage, so it's kind of funny. His Eidolons do make it easier to apply wind shear and increases the amount of damage he deals with it. Like I said, he does apply a debuff to enemies. Dots are debuffs as well by the definition of the game, but they don't provide utility in the same way that, for instance, Pela's defense shred does. Her debuffs are actual debuffs that serve to support your team. All Sampo's kit does is deal damage over time and help to enable you to deal as much damage over time as possible. Functionally, that makes him much more similar to a traditional damage dealer like Serval than he is to a debuffer like Pela. Looking at our launch day units as a whole, I would say Pela's actually the strongest of the three, as she's still a very good option for most teams since her debuff is universally useful in just about any kind of team. But the other two, well, they can find uses in particular niches if you invested in them as well. Once again, Welt is a pseudo-sustain, and Sampo is a piece of your dot core if you really want to go there. Phew, that's only 3 units in, and I've already rambled about the class overall, more so than I did for a lot of classes, but hey, that's Nihility for you. Next up on the list is Silverwolf, who leans us back into the regular debuffer kit structure. She's actually a really interesting character from a kit design perspective, especially for how early into the game we are. I mean, this is only the second version of the game. She's a 1.1 unit. Her talent allows her to apply debuffs whenever attacking that can lower enemy speed, attack, or defense, but her skill is where she really becomes interesting. By gaming on the enemy so hard, because that's just what she just games and that's how she does things, she can add a weakness to the enemy that they didn't already possess, and that's pretty cool. And at the time of her release, it was absolute witchcraft. It seemed like a must-pull unit to players because of how unique this piece of utility was. This was more useful in teams with fewer elements present, as she had a chance to implant any weakness that matched a teammate's element. This meant that if you had 2 elements, she had a 50% chance to implant either one, it'd be a 1 in 3 chance if you had 3 elements, and it was a 100% chance to be that specific element if you were, running only quantum units. Which, you can do. I think it's fun. I still do it from time to time. The team sucks these days. It's been power crept all to hell, but hey, you could still do it. It's pretty fun. Anyway, this weakness implant also offered Res Shred to match their fancy new weakness, which was also cool. This seemed like a universally good unit that could debuff enemies in multiple ways and help near any team. And for a while, that was actually true. I know we later get a bunch of damage dealers that either implant their own weaknesses or ignore weaknesses, but I feel like I haven't discussed the meta at the time of release for each character as much in the past few episodes, so I feel like we should really give Silverwolf her flowers here, because when she came out, she was genuinely a game-changing unit. Game, because she's a gamer. Nah, you get it? Gaming. We do that, right? That's relatable. We're gamers. Yeah, okay. Anyway, she was viewed as a very future-proof and incredibly useful unit, and she certainly was, at least for the time. Even now, her implant and debuff potential offer very good utility, but at the time of her release, she was, like I said, a game-changer for a lot of people. And so far, Sampo really kind of feels like an anomaly, doesn't he? We have 3 actual debuffers, and then we have just Sampo. He's a dot unit, and he's the only one, which is kind of weird, but don't worry, we're about to go on a bit of a kick when it comes to adding dot units to the game, because there's going to be quite a few of them, and then none of them. That's just kind of how it works. It's a binging and purging thing when it comes to Hoyo and dot units. They got to add a whole bunch, and then just drop it cold turkey. One patch after we got Silverwolf, we'd start the binging process when it comes to our binging of dot units, and trust me, we're going to get a few of them in a row here. It's Luca. We're going to start with the 4-star. We have a 5-star to talk about as well, but we'll get the 4-star out of the way in this patch first. He is another dot damage dealer, but it is worth mentioning that he does have one actual debuff on his kit, on his ult, and unlike Sampo's actual debuff, Luca's isn't focused solely on dot, as his ult can increase the damage an enemy takes in general, not just from dot. While this is objectively speaking a good piece of utility, the main focus of Luca's kit is applying bleed through his skill and advanced basic attack. His kit allows him to trigger the bleed damage instantly whenever he uppercuts the shit out of an enemy, which is something he does, and it's pretty cool, I guess. And his Eidolons are all focused on this as well. They also increase his personal damage in a couple different ways, but he's a dot unit through and through, and while he occasionally sees some actions as pseudo-break unit as well, it's clear that he's meant to be played in a team centered around a damage over time effects. That being said, it's kind of hard to make a dot team if your only options for real dot units are Luca and Sampo. If only that we had a way to, fix that. I mean, if it's going to be a real team archetype, it's going to need something more than just a couple 4-stars to hold it together, which is why this banner that gave us Luca also gave us the much anticipated at the time Kafka, the 5-star dot unit. Kafka really exists in order to establish the actual playstyle of the dot archetype. She's very good at applying dots herself, having her ultimate and a follow-up attack that applies dots rather consistently. Her skill, on the other hand, is a blast damage that also causes its target to take damage for every dot on them. This could be Kafka's dot that she applied to them, or it could be applied by someone like Sampo or Luca, or just a dot directly from weakness breaking an enemy. This means that if you have a lot of dots on the target, well, they'll take a lot of damage. Her first Ascension passive also allows her ult to deal damage for all the dots on an enemy, so it's pretty easy to see that Kafka is meant to be the centerpiece of the dot-focused team. So that's pretty cool. I mean, she has an interesting kit, but you know what she doesn't do? Debuff the friggin' enemy! Like I said before, I'm well aware that dots are debuffs, but I know, and you know, that they don't perform similarly at all, and are just another form of damage dealing. Also, I think that Kafka does have a dot damage vulnerability debuff in her E1, I'm pretty sure, but like with Sampo, that's just for dot damage, and it's also behind a premium 5-star Eidolon, and we don't really talk about those for the most part. Kafka is, like her fellow dot units, a damage dealer. And that's okay, by the way. In fact, I think it's cool. I think damage over time is a cool playstyle for a game like this. I don't play dot, but I do really actually like a lot of the units. I like a lot of the characters that fit into the archetype. But I will continue to point out, partially for fun and partially because it's true, that Nihility really is just two separate classes slapped together. It's totally cool for units in a class to play differently, but all the other classes kind of stick to their stated goal at the very least, better than Nihility does. Robin can do some non-insignificant damage, but she's there to buff your party more than anything else. Most of the hunt units are follow-up attack units, but even the hunt units that aren't, like Boothill, are focused on single target damage dealing, which is what the class is actually about. Fujuan isn't a shielder, but she plays the same role because her main role is still damage reduction, damage mitigation, which is what a preservation unit is there to do. The issue with dot and debuff units being the same thing isn't that they have a different playstyle. That's fine, and actually something that I would encourage. Classes all having the exact same playstyle throughout their class is kind of boring. But the problem is they don't have the same objective. That's the point I'm more or less trying to get across. Like, not every Harmony unit has to have action advance, or not every Harmony unit has to buff attack, or buff crit, or buff something specific, but they're all going to buff something. Whereas, these debuffers aren't really debuffing, are they? You know? The final 1.x Nihility unit is actually another 4-star, Gwynaifen, and I really don't have a lot of negative stuff to say about her, mostly because she's just a ball of sunshine and I want to hang out with her. She seems like a cool person. That being said, while she is mostly just a fire dot unit, she does have a general purpose debuff with her Fire Kiss debuff provided by her talent, which just straight up makes enemies take more damage. She also has a, albeit pretty minor, effect res debuff that can come from her E1. Now, this does technically mean she's a genuinely usable debuffer when it comes to just general use cases. However, she is still, like I said, by and large a fire dot unit that helps give you another great option to use alongside the likes of Kafka and her growing gaggle of dot 4-star units to choose from. Aside from the parts of her kit that I've already mentioned, the rest of it is focused on inflicting the burn dot onto enemies and dealing as much damage as possible with those burns, which is to be expected from what is admittedly another dot unit. See, once again, it's funny, right? Like, as soon as we got to Silverwolf, we then just decided to dump all of our Nihility units into the dot bucket. We've gotten 3 new units since Silverwolf that we've talked about. All of them are dot units. Like I said, it's a binging and purging thing. And we have not finished binging yet, by the way. We have made it through all the 1.x units. That leads us to the very start of the second major version of the game, where we get the final dot unit. And yes, like I said, the final dot unit, because once again, it's a binging and purging thing, man. They add all the dot units and then none. Not a drop more after that. That being said, this final dot unit is a bit of a big step for them, as it's their second dedicated damage over time 5-star. Once again, the only other one they're ever going to get, but hey, at least they got 2 of them. Black Swan is that dot unit, and she is certainly something. She's actually got quite a lot of stuff happening in her kit, so I'll summarize some of it kind of briefly. Arcana stacks are the main thing she does. Arcana stacks cause the afflicted target to take wind dot damage, and the multiplier increases every time they get more stacks, so basically you're getting a whole bunch of these stacks on, and then, you're just watching everything, like, die from 1,000 cuts, like, literally. She can stack Arcana in a couple different ways: basic attacks, skills, other dots, a lot of ways to get these stacks. She also has a defense debuff in her kit, which, to be fair, is a general purpose debuff, and, she's also really, really pretty, and I think she has a belt on her head, which is kind of silly, but at this point, I assume most people know that Kafka and Black Swan are the center of the Dot archetype, and the core of your Dot team. Black Swan was a big step up for Dot. Unfortunately, like I said, it's also the last step that Dot would ever get to take, at least in the form of dedicated Dot support. Now, other supports and other units that can maybe work with them would come out, but as far as actual dedicated Dot units, it really begins and ends here when we finish talking about Black Swan. I don't want to undersell Black Swan, by the way, because she's a very good unit. Very cool, helps the archetype a lot. Her Arcana stacks can get kind of crazy. She helps you deal a lot of Dot damage. She and Kafka, really good team together. But yeah, she's going to be the last Dot unit we talk about because there aren't any more. Now, maybe throughout the 3.x series of patches, we'll get more Dot units, but we'll just have to see about that. But you know what else is weird? We're now into the 2.0 patch. And we haven't gotten I guess what you can call a traditional debuffer since Silverwolf. Every unit from 1.2 onward through this 2.0 patch that happened to be Nihility was a Dot unit. So the main idea, it seems, of the class, which is debuffs, hasn't been the main focus of a unit that the class has released since the second version of the game. Which is crazy, but hey, like I said, this is the end of the Dot units, so, it is what it is. It sucks that it's the end of Dot units. You might think that I'm happy about that. I'm not. It sucks that this playstyle kind of goes unsupported from here on out. Like, I do wish they were their own class, but, like, they're cool characters and they're a cool playstyle. But yes, there is a part of me that's like, okay, we're finally done with that. We're done with Dot, and that means we can just go ahead and talk about a regular, normal debuffer, and we do have another Nihility 5-star coming in the very next patch, so I'm really interested to see what direction the devs wanted to go when it comes to... What in the ever-living fuck is that? Oh boy. Oh god. I just wanted a debuffer. Look, if you're familiar at all with these characters, at all, you probably have been waiting for me to reach this point for a good while now. Acheron is the Nihility unit, which is funny because she's an erudition character. Acheron is a main damage dealer that still falls under the umbrella of the Nihility class. Her main role on a team is to get her ult up and then nuke the ever-living crap out of any and everything in a 10-mile radius. That being said, her kit is linked to the class and its goals in a weird way. It's kind of a cool way, admittedly, but it's weird. She doesn't have an energy gauge for her ult, and instead gains a stack for it every time you inflict a debuff on an enemy. This means that while she doesn't fulfill the role of a Nihility unit, her kit is built around other units performing the role. It's a strange way to design a character, but at the very least, it became part of what made her so iconic in the game. Well, there's a lot of things that make this character really iconic, but her kit design and playstyle is certainly one of them. Aside from Black Swan, Acheron was the first damage dealer unit released in the 2.x series of patches, and, Dot doesn't exist from here on out, so Black Swan doesn't even really count. So Acheron being the first real damage dealer in the 2.x series of patches set a massive precedent for the massive surge in power that damage dealers would get in the coming patches. I've talked about this surge of power in other videos in the forms of units like the Break Carries, Fei Xiao, and even units like Jade as well. It all started here with Acheron, becoming what was basically the consensus strongest unit in the game upon release, at least as far as damage dealers are concerned. We've talked about in the Harmony video that, Harmony units are the real broken units, but as far as actual damage dealers are concerned, Acheron was a tier above the rest from the day she came out. Now, with anything, there are some exceptions. The types of enemies you're facing can always matter, along with the blessings and buffs that any particular piece of content gives you, and you also have to take team building into account and who you can and can't run with other people. But if you asked anyone who the strongest damage dealer in the game was at the time of Acheron's release, it would be pretty likely that they would say Acheron. She's iconic, she's meta-defining, she's a friggin' erudition unit that can equip Nihility light cones, but she's beloved regardless. And like I said before, it is really crazy now that if we look at the timeline up to this point, after releasing Silverwolf in the second version of the game, they have not released another unit whose purpose is just to provide general purpose debuffs to enemies. All the units we get after Silverwolf up through Black Swan were all dot units, and while some of those units do have debuffs, they mostly focus on buffing dot specifically, or at least improving the dot playstyle, with it being their primary purpose, and any actual debuffs they have being kind of a secondary feature. Then the first time we stray away from dot in 2.1, we get a frickin' hyper carry unit? And not only do we get a hyper carry unit, we get one that is so broken that they overshadow all the actual damage dealing classes units, bar none, up to this point. It's crazy. This class makes absolutely no frickin' sense. I know some people understood it when I joked about it, that this is kind of what I meant, but there are some people that are like, I don't know what you have with Nihility, it's just as normal as all the other classes, but man, it is simply not. It is its own beast, it doesn't follow any kind of formula, it has no actual through line, it's just doing its own thing. And by the way, that's fine. Nihility has some of the coolest units in the game and some of the most iconic units in the game, but the actual structure of the class itself is just so nonsensical, and I think that's funny. I don't have any angst or any anger about that, but I just think it's really, really funny how little sense this class actually makes. The fact that there's so much to joke around about and point out when it comes to this class is why I'm assuming this is going to be the longest of the class history, class review videos we've done. That being said, I don't actually know for sure because I'm, still writing this line as I read the script. I haven't recorded this yet, so I'm just going to assume that this one probably took a little bit longer than some of the other ones. That being said, time to move on. The Superman cometh. I don't know when it is that I started calling Jiao Chu Soup, or the Soup Guy, or the Soup Man, but I do. I call this man Soup because he, cooks, and his ult has a big ol' hot bowl of soup in it, so yeah. He's Soup, he's at Soup, and oh my god, he's actually a debuffer. The Soup Man is actually just a debuffer. He's not weird. He does what you would expect him to do. What a joyous day this is. Praise him. Praise be the great and mighty Soup Man. Long may he reign, and full may his soup bowl be. Anyway, so the Soup Man came out in the 2.4 patch, the back half of the 2.4 patch, in fact, I believe, which means from the beginning of the second phase of 2.1 all the way through the end of the first phase of 2.4, no more Nihility units were released, which, considering that we got so many of them, especially considering we got a whole bunch of post-launch 4-stars, this is probably the longest we went without actually having a new Nihility unit added to the game. Soup was viewed as being primarily an Acheron support as he was coming out, which meant that he kind of just served as another debuffer that could apply multiple debuffs to enemies to quickly gain more stacks for Acheron's ult. It wasn't just that, though, it was also that his debuffs were all suited for her kit. He provided a debuff that just straight up made enemies take more damage, and then also made enemies specifically take more ultimate damage. And since Acheron is all about nuking enemies with her ult, that's basically perfect for her. He fits in nicely with Acheron, but can also be used in other teams as a more general-purpose buffer as well. The Soup Man didn't break the game or anything, but he knew what his job was, and he did it well. He debuffed the enemy, and made soup, I guess, so shout out to him. I really like this guy. His job is to debuff enemies. He does that, he does it well, and I appreciate that about him. After the Soup Man, we actually go all the way up to the present day, Fugue. So, before I get really into Fugue, the final Nihility unit, the final 2.x unit, and, well, I guess the final unit we're covering in this series. Didn't really think about that. Well, when writing this video, I had the basic idea of what I was going to say about most of these units kind of down pat. I knew, I had to look up some things, make sure, hey, did this person actually have this debuff and things like that, but for the most part, I was like, yeah, I know what I'm going to say about these units. But I hadn't really thought about what I was going to say about Fugue. Of course, I've pulled and used this unit because she's a break unit, and I pull all of those, but, well, I didn't really think about this before, but, this is a fucking Harmony unit, right? I mean, right? The unit she's the most similar to utility-wise, the unit she's replacing, is Harmony Trailblazer, who is Harmony. Her talent buffs your team by providing super break, like the MC does, though she also adds secondary break bars to enemies, and that's kind of a debuff. She also does have a defense shred debuff that does a similar job to what Gallagher and Lingshaw's break damage debuff is, since for the most part, since you're using Fugue and Break, you're using it to increase break damage. But that's the thing, having those debuffs doesn't make Gallagher and Lingshot Nihility units. It's just a little extra thing that they do. Fuch's skill also doesn't apply a debuff. In fact, as far as I can tell, she's the only Nihility unit whose skill is cast on an ally. Her skill buffs your allies' break effect and also buffs them by giving them colorless break. I'm not saying that she doesn't have debuffs, she does, but she has more buffs than debuffs, and it doesn't feel close. I know limited Eidolons aren't usually part of the discussion since most people won't get them and you probably shouldn't get them, but if you look at her Eidolons, they're absolutely Eidolons you would find on a Harmony unit. E1 gives a weakness break efficiency buff to the ally she skills on. E2 gives action advance to your team when she ults, which is such a Harmony thing to do, and it's such a Harmony thing to do because literally the best 4-star Harmony light cone has the exact same effect. Her E4 is a break damage buff to the ally she skills. Her E6, well, it increases her personal break efficiency. It also makes her skill buff applied to all allies. Every single Eidolon is a Harmony unit Eidolon. None of these things have anything to do with debuffs, except kind of her E6, because to be fair, her E6 applying her skill buff to everyone does make it easier to apply her defense shred debuff, since that gets applied when a unit with her skill attacks. So, you know, her E6 does impact her ability to debuff enemies, but even that is more about buffing allies than it is defense debuffing enemies. Now, the defense debuff, by the way, is also a good debuff. I'm not saying it's not. Defense shred is universally good on every team. We went over this all the way at the beginning when we talked about Pela. Fugue is a very good unit. I think she's a really, really good unit, but let's be honest, she's not really a debuffer, right? And like, this isn't me like trying to poke holes in a character and like, you know, really trying to, like, you don't have to connect the dots very much to realize this is a Harmony unit, right? I really just laid it out for you that 80% of her kit is buffs and not debuffs, right? So let me know in the comments if you think Fugue should be a Harmony unit, but like, I think she really should be. I mean, at least mechanically speaking, she already is. I've heard people say they didn't want her to be a Harmony unit so that she wouldn't be able to use Harmony light cones. That's like a balance thing, but like, you literally put dance, dance, dance in her Eidolons, so clearly that wasn't the biggest problem, right? I don't know. It just seems very odd. I mean, Fugue does a great job, by the way, of being the cherry on top of the break archetype of characters. She gives you another great option as a buffer and super break enabler, and I'm glad I pulled her. I do find it hilarious, though, that she's yet another Nihility unit that doesn't really feel like she's supposed to be a Nihility unit. And I'm not stretching the truth or anything, right? This is like just kind of pretty obvious if you actually look at her kit that she's really just a Harmony unit. Well, anyway, we're all caught up now, right? Every single Nihility unit, and I guess by extension, since this is the last class, every single unit period has been talked about. We've wrapped things up nicely here with Nihility, but I think we still need to just kind of take stock of just how wonky this class is one more time. If we take a look at all the Nihility units in their totality, and try to see how many of them exist to support your team through debuffing the enemy, we really only have a few that really fall into that category. Pela and Weltz, two of the Day 1 units, Silverwolf, an early addition to the roster, and the Soup Man himself, who was much more of a later addition. And yeah, you could say that some of the dot units do have legitimate debuffs in their kit that aren't even necessarily just contained a dot, like we talked about Little Gui having the Fire Kiss debuff in her kit that's a general damage taken debuff. But at the same time, Topaz has a pretty massive debuff as one of the central parts of her kit. The mark that determines Numby's target is a massive debuff against follow-up attack damage specifically. But the fact that she has a debuff isn't enough to make her a Nihility unit, and frankly, her playstyle and the objective that she has as a character is a lot closer to traditionally what a Nihility unit is seemingly supposed to be. Like, that is one of her main pieces of utility, is the fact that she debuffs you against specific follow-up attack damage, and that's why she's support for the follow-up attack archetype. Now, she does good damage on her own, and you can buff her and try to make like a Topaz Hypercarry team, but like the best team that she's in right now is buffing Fei Zhao by making Fei Zhao do even more damage with her follow-up attack damage. And if Topaz, a character who much more closely aligns with what Nihility is seemingly about, being focused on supporting your team through debuffs, is a hunt unit and not a Nihility unit, then how am I going to argue that a unit like Kafka, who is just a dot damage dealer, is a Nihility unit, you know? Looking away from the dots for a second, we have the other two characters that are Nihility units in name, but not really in function, when Acheron and Fugue. And Fugue is just a Harmony unit wearing a Nihility name tag, and we've covered that already. But Acheron, I mean, she's a damage dealer, but she's focused on being supported by debuffs, so she should be a Nihility unit, right? Okay. Dr. Ratio is exactly what I just described Acheron as, and obviously, he's a Hunt unit. And that doesn't mean that, Acheron has to be one type of unit or another, because look, in the end, as much as I've liked to poke fun at how kind of disorganized and messy Nihility is, the classes themselves, and this is kind of going to sound funny since I've been talking about the structure of the classes themselves throughout all these videos, it doesn't matter. I mean, in the end, the only real thing that your class determines is what kind of light cones you can equip. So, yeah, Acheron could be a Nihility unit, she could be and maybe should be an Erudition unit. In the end, that really, once again, just determines what light cones she can equip anyway. So while I've had some fun here, kind of at the expense of the Nihility class, in the end, it doesn't matter that it's a wonky class, because, well, it's Nihility. It doesn't matter. Nothing matters. The only thing that matters is the void, and as it consumes all, matter itself ceases to matter. As the all-consuming darkness and never-marching force of time consumes everything one day until time itself is consumed by the void. So yeah, big surprise. In the end, the class whose name is literally about nothing mattering, it doesn't matter if it's disorganized. Could have figured that one out, I guess. It has an Erudition unit in it. Okay, who cares? It's still a busted Erudition unit, and probably one of the strongest units in the game still. It has a Harmony unit. Okay, well, it's a busted unit, so who cares? It has an entire damage-dealing archetype that could have potentially been its own class in it. Okay, does it work? That doesn't matter. Nihility is a really fun class, and that's kind of why I wanted to save it till last. It's fun to talk about, fun to joke about, but it's all in good fun. I do like a lot of these characters. There's some really, really good ones, and I do appreciate all these characters, even the silly ones that I think should be their own archetype, okay? But that's that. We did it. We covered every single type of the unit in the game. Every class has been covered, which means every unit has been covered. So, thank you guys so much for watching these. These videos have done really, really well. I know this is a very small channel, but the fact that these have gotten thousands of views is really impressive, considering that this is such a small channel. We just hit 700 subscribers, and I think that's pretty cool, so thanks for that. Hopefully we get 1,000 here in the few early months of 2025. I'll try to make some more interesting content about different games that I'm interested in and different topics. And of course, we'll still talk about these gacha games because I've sold my soul to them. But really, thank you guys for watching these videos. Like, comment, tell me how you felt about the video. Tell me what your favorite history video was that we did, your favorite class, your favorite unit, all that good stuff. I'd love to hear it. I'll try to respond to as many of them down below as you guys comment. So that's about it. We did it. I finally set out to do something, and I finished a series, I guess, because this became a series, so we finished that, and pat myself on the back for that, I guess. I appreciate you guys a lot, and like I said, like if you like the video, comment if you have anything to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and I'll see what we can do here in 2025. Squangus.